Chapter 1: The Wind and the Monastery, Part 1. The Valley of Silence in the heart of the mountain, where pine trees touched the sky and the mist never truly lifted. There was a monastery older than any living man could remember, and in this monastery, the wind had never stopped speaking. The valley was not marked on any map. It wasn't a secret, just forgotten. The path to reach it was winding, unpaved, and overgrown with moss and roots. Few travelers came, and those who did arrived out of accident more than intention. Perhaps that, too, was a kind of divine design. The monastery stood like a sleeping elder, its wooden beams darkened by rain, its stone foundations softened by time. Ivy clung to the walls like silent prayers. Wind chimes made of bamboo hung from every corner, swaying softly day and night. There were no clocks, no radios, no buzzing phones, only the rhythm of the wind, the rhythm of the breath. In this place lived monks of all ages, from boys with shaved heads and wide eyes, to elders whose faces had deepened into maps of stillness. Among them was one figure that most overlooked, the bowl keeper. He was not a master nor a teacher. He gave no sermons, sat in no councils, and offered no corrections. He lived in the farthest room at the end of the narrow eastern corridor, past the lantern storeroom and beneath the oldest beams. The other monks rarely spoke to him. Some believed he was half deaf. Others thought he preferred silence to words. The truth was simpler. He listened more than he spoke, and the world whispered to those who did. His real name had long been forgotten, or perhaps simply left behind in temple records. He was listed as Monk Nu, 47, but even that number had faded on the ink-stained paper. In truth, he had become known only for what he did, tending to the bowls. In the monastery, each monk had one bowl. It was used for everything: eating, serving, offering. Some were ceramic, others stoneware. A few were wooden. Each had its own shape, color, and imperfection. The bowls were not labeled or locked, but somehow they always returned to the hands of the same owner. Every morning before dawn, before even the bell rang, the bowl keeper would rise. His room was bare: a sleeping mat, a low wooden table, and a small shelf holding cloths, oils, and a single candle. As the sky turned from black to blue, he would light the candle and begin his ritual. He moved slowly, reverently, as though each breath might shatter the quiet. He would unwrap a cloth the color of old tea leaves and choose one bowl. Sometimes it was chipped, sometimes dusty, sometimes perfect. He never skipped one. He would cradle it like something alive and begin to clean it, not hurriedly. Not with soap, but with warm water, bare hands, and cloth. Each bowl, he once whispered to a passing novice who had the courage to ask, is not for food. It is for stillness. To him, the bowl was more than a vessel. It was a pause in the world, a place where things were received, held, and released. Some monks meditated with beads. He meditated with bowls. Outside his window, the pine trees swayed in the wind. The wind always moved through the valley like a quiet guest, sometimes laughing, sometimes sighing, but always present. The bowl keeper believed the wind knew secrets that words could not hold, and that by caring for something simple like a bowl, he was tuning his ear to those secrets. There was a story the younger monks passed around in hushed tones. They said the bowl keeper had once been a great scholar in the northern monasteries, that he had left behind scrolls, honors, disciples. No one knew if it was true. He never confirmed, and no one dared ask directly, but his eyes carried a depth like the surface of still water. Something had been dropped in long ago. and the ripples had only just begun to fade. Part 2. The keeper's hands, hands that do not hurry, will never drop the world. Every morning, before the sun rose above the mountains, the keeper of bowls sat cross-legged on a straw mat. A thin line of smoke curled from the corner of a handmade clay burner, releasing the scent of old sandalwood into the stillness. He never lit it for ritual, only for company. In this life of breath and bowl, even fragrance could be a friend. On the table beside him lay a folded cloth, the same cloth he had used for years, if not decades. Its edges were frayed, but it was always clean. A wooden tray held the bowls he would tend that day. No one instructed him on how many to clean. He let his hands choose, not his mind. He picked up the first bowl gently, cupping it with both palms, as though it were made of mist. It was a shallow, earthen-colored piece with a faint crack near the rim. It belonged to Brother Yoan, a quiet monk who hummed while sweeping the stone paths. The keeper touched the crack with his thumb, not to test it, but to remember it. Each imperfection was a history, not a flaw. He dipped the bowl into a basin of warm water, turning it slowly. No soap, only time and intention. Then, with his cloth, he wiped it dry, moving in circular motions, as if retracing the path of the moon. The cloth glided over the surface like wind on still water. His fingers didn't just touch the bowl, they listened to it. In this monastery, everything had a voice. Not the kind that used words, but the kind that waited patiently for you to slow down enough to hear it. Once, when he was young, he had broken a bowl. It was not just any bowl, was the last piece of a master's set, brought from a distant land. The night he broke it, he couldn't sleep. He had buried the fragments beneath a tree behind the meditation hall, then confessed. The next morning, the master said nothing. No anger, no punishment, just silence. A week later, the master called him into his chamber and handed him a new bowl. It looked simple, but as the keeper later learned, it had taken the master 3 days to carve it himself. It is not the bowl, the master had said, that you broke. It is the moment. Now hold the next one with both hands. From that moment, the boy became the keeper. He never again touched a bowl casually. He never allowed another to go unseen, unwashed, or uncared for. To the outside world, his work seemed small, repetitive, but to him, it was everything. It was the rhythm of care. He believed the bowl held more than rice. It held the morning. It held silence. It held the fingerprints of every person who had paused long enough to eat with attention. When the young monks saw him, they only saw an old man with slow fingers. But his slowness was not weakness. It was a vow to never treat any act as unimportant. Even when he aged and his joints stiffened, the ritual never changed. He never rushed. When pain visited his knuckles, he bowed to it like an old friend. "You are here too," he would whisper. "I will hold you gently as I do the bowl." Outside, the wind would rise with the sun, passing through the pine needles, like breath through prayer beads. Some mornings it was soft. Other days it howled like forgotten grief. But always the bowl keeper heard it. The bowls, once cleaned, were returned to their shelf in perfect stillness, lined like monks in meditation, each one facing slightly east toward the morning light. Sometimes, when the light fell just right, it would pass through a cracked bowl and scatter into small rainbows on the wooden wall. He never interrupted these moments. He would simply sit there, bowl in hand, watching the play of brokenness and light. He once said to a novice who lingered longer than usual, "A bowl that has seen fire that has known cracks reflects more beauty than one untouched. Don't polish yourself out of your story. That novice never forgot those words, and one day became the head of the kitchen. He still washed his own bowl, long after his rank excused him from such chores. The keeper's hands, though wrinkled and weathered, were remembered by every surface they touched, like water that left no wound, only shape. Part 3. The Whispering Wind. The wind does not ask questions, it simply listens. That evening, the valley wore a different silence, one charged with weight, like the pause before a confession. The sky was a deeper grey than usual, and the pine trees trembled as if remembering something. By twilight, the air had grown heavy and thick, like wet cloth hanging in the lungs. The monks finished their evening meal in near silence. Only a few words passed between them, and even those were whispers. In places like this, people learned to hear the subtle signs of the natural world. Tonight, the wind was speaking louder than usual. The bowl-keeper remained in his room, polishing the final bowl for the day. It was a dark brown one, shaped like an upturned bell. It belonged to a monk who had left the monastery years ago. Brother Keon. Keon had been the bowl-keeper's closest friend during their younger years. Where the keeper was silent and slow, Keon had been radiant and full of questions. He was always climbing trees, reading aloud under the sun, humming chants while stirring the rice pot. For a time, they were inseparable, two halves of a balanced breath. But Keon had left, not in anger, not in rebellion, simply ... in restlessness. There is more I must find, he had said one morning, tying his robe tighter than usual. You won't find it beyond these trees, the keeper had warned gently. Perhaps, Keon replied with a smile, but I must walk far enough to believe you. He left behind only his bowl and a letter, folded 3 times and tucked into. It's hollow. The letter said nothing of substance, only a single line. I will return when the wind knows my name. The bowl-keeper kept the bowl on a high shelf, dusted it once a week, and never used it. Now, as the wind gathered outside, the bowl-keeper held Keon's bowl with both hands, letting his fingers rest in the curve of the rim. The crackle of dry leaves scattered across the stone courtyard. Wind chimes shrieked not in melody, but in mourning. A lantern blew out down the hall. Someone hurried to close a wooden shutter, but the bowl-keeper stood, slowly, and stepped outside. The courtyard was painted in shades of ash and indigo. Pine needles danced like lost thoughts in the air. The wind was no longer gentle. It was pulling, insistent, alive, and yet he was not afraid. He moved toward the central garden and sat on the stone bench beneath the Bodhi tree. The bench was cold, but familiar. The tree above him swayed wildly, its leaves rustling like the pages of an unwritten book. The wind howled and whistled and twisted through the corridors. It knocked over a lantern, sent a curtain flailing into the sky, and pried open a loose shutter. But the bowl-keeper remained still, Keon's bowl still resting in his lap. He closed his eyes and whispered to the night, "If you see him, tell him I waited." In the rush of wind, he imagined he heard an answer, not words, not voice, but a feeling, the kind that rests just at the edge of remembering. The gusts softened. The pine trees no longer thrashed, but sighed. He opened his eyes. A small scrap of parchment floated down from the upper walkway, twirling like a falling petal. It landed at his feet. He picked it up, blank but still. He smiled. "So you did come back," he whispered, "even if only on the wind." He stood up slowly and walked back toward his room. Keon's bowl still in hand. The world seemed lighter, somehow, as though the wind had taken some weight with it. That night, as he lay on his mat, the wind curled against the walls like a cat returning home. He left the window open just a little, so the air could come and go as it pleased. He dreamed of two boys running through the mist, one chasing the other. Laughing, he didn't need to know where they were going. He only needed to remember they once ran together. Part 4. The Young Monk's Shadow. Sometimes the question is more important than the answer. He had noticed the boy before, the small footsteps that always seemed to pause outside his door, the way the cloth curtain shifted just slightly and then stilled, the nervous hush when his sandals tapped the wooden floor too loud, and especially the gaze, quiet but steady, like moonlight through clouds. The boy was called Toma, barely 10 seasons into his life. He had been brought to the monastery by an aunt who said only, "His heart is too loud for the world." No more was spoken. No more was needed. Toma was smaller than most novices, curious in ways that annoyed the older monks. He didn't fidget or disobey. He simply asked too many questions. Why do we bow before meals? If the wind doesn't see, how can it move? The chimes. Does the Buddha ever sleep? Most of the monks responded with tired smiles or sent him off to sweep leaves. But one day, after breakfast, he crept into the eastern corridor, drawn by the smell of sandalwood and the glimmer of something. Calm. The bowl keeper was sitting cross-legged, cleaning a deep, blue-speckled bowl. Toma froze in the doorway. The old man looked up slowly, not startled, not scolding. "You may enter," he said gently, "but leave your questions outside." Toma stepped in, bowing slightly, unsure if he was supposed to. He sat at a respectful distance, watching the man's hands move in quiet arcs. "Do you ever get tired of bowls?" the boy asked. The keeper paused, not in irritation, but in consideration. "Sometimes," he replied, "but not of what they hold." Tama's brow furrowed. "Rice." The old man shook his head, smiling softly. Stillness. There was silence again, not awkward but full. Toma stared at the rows of bowls stacked neatly on the low shelf. "Can I touch one?" The keeper gestured slowly, selecting a plain, smooth bowl from the shelf. He held it out with 2 hands. "Only if you do not use your eyes." The boy blinked. "How else can I see it? With your skin, your breath, the weight in your palms." Carefully, Toma reached out, closing his eyes. He cupped the bowl gently and inhaled. It was warm from the keeper's touch. The rim was slightly uneven. A tiny chip grazed his thumb. He ran his fingers along its curve, learning without sight. And for the first time in days, he didn't ask a question. When he opened his eyes, he looked different, less like a boy who wanted answers and more like someone who had just heard a story no one had spoken. The keeper handed him a small cloth, the size of a napkin. "Take this. Wipe your bowl after each meal, not for cleanliness, but for attention." Toma held it like it was made of gold thread. "What if I forget?" "Then remember," said the old man, "as soon as you notice. You forgot. That is the way of practice." From that day on, Toma became a shadow, not the kind that hides, but the kind that learns. He sat outside the keeper's room most mornings, not speaking unless invited. He would watch the man's movements, the way he unfolded the cloth as if unwrapping a prayer, the way he bowed slightly before and after every cleaning, the way he never rushed, even when the wind outside grew wild, and sometimes The old man would tell him short stories, like the tale of a bird who had forgotten how to sing and wandered the mountains in silence until it heard the sound of the wind moving through hollow reeds, then realized that was its song all along. Toma never knew what to say after these stories, but he stopped asking questions, not because he had answers, but because he had found something better: stillness. And the keeper began to smile more often, he once told Toma. To care for a bowl is not to make it shine. It is to make yourself clear enough that you no longer cast shadows upon it. That evening, the boy polished his own bowl for the first time. It was crooked, stained from mischief, and heavier than it looked. He did not wipe quickly. He breathed with it, sat with it, and whispered, "Thank you," when he finished. That night, the wind returned softly, slipping between beams and windows like a lullaby. And for the first time since his arrival, Toma slept deeply dreamless, but full. Part 5. The cloth and the lesson to touch with care is to listen without needing words. The morning after his first visit to the keeper's room, Toma walked more slowly. There was a new weight in his paqueta, small folded cloth, soft as moth wings. He had tucked it into the folds of his robe the moment he received it, unsure whether to keep it hidden like treasure or show it like a badge. He chose neither. He simply held it, sometimes pressing it between his palms like a silent prayer. At breakfast, he didn't chatter with the other novices. He watched. He noticed the way steam rose from the rice, the way the elder monks chewed without haste, and how some of them closed their eyes between bites. When the meal ended, he stayed behind and wiped his bowl slowly with the cloth. He didn't do it perfectly. His fingers trembled a little, and the cloth slipped once, nearly falling to the ground. But he caught it, steadied his breath, and continued. It was not grace, but it was intention. The bowl keeper watched from a distance, unseen. Later that day, as the shadows shifted across the courtyard stones, Toma returned to the old man's door. He did not speak, only sat near the threshold, the cloth now folded neatly in his lap. The keeper glanced at him and raised an eyebrow, not a scowl, just a nudge. "So," he said, "what did the bowl say?" Toma looked up, unsure if it was a trick. "It didn't say anything," he replied. "Ah," the keeper smiled. "Then you weren't quiet enough." Toma blushed. The old monk motioned for him to enter. Inside, everything looked as it had the day before. The night-low table, bowls lined like silent students. But now Toma noticed more. The way the candles flame flickered without fear, the smell of warm wood, the faint trace of dust caught in the sunbeam through the window. "Come," said the keeper, "today you will clean a bowl." Toma's eyes widened. "But I'm not ready." "Then let the bowl teach you." The keeper placed a pale porcelain bowl between them. It had no visible cracks, but its glaze had faded unevenly with age. He laid out a second cloth-fold, thin, perfectly folded, and gestured. Toma knelt and picked up the bowl with two hands, mimicking what he'd seen. He held it too tightly at first, then too loosely. His breath came short. The keeper said nothing. Then slowly, the boy found his rhythm. He dipped the cloth in warm water and wrung it out gently. He moved the cloth over the bowl's edge, his eyes focused, not furrowed. He wasn't trying to clean it, he was learning how it felt to move slowly, to notice. Midway through, he paused. "Why do we use cloth?" he asked softly. "Because fingers rush," the keeper replied, "but cloth remembers." They sat like that for a long time. Bowl, elder, and wind. After the final wipe, Toma held up the bowl for inspection. The keeper didn't look at the surface. He looked at the boy's face. "Good," he said. "The bowl is not the lesson. You are." Toma blinked. The words didn't quite land, but something inside him stirred, as though a door had cracked open a sliver, letting in wind as Toma stood to leave. The keeper added one more sentence. "Tomorrow, bring your own bowl. To clean, to listen." Toma nodded, but his mind was already turning. For the first time, he wondered, had his bowl ever spoken to him, or had he been too loud inside to hear it? That night, Toma dreamed not of monks or chants or chores, but of bowls floating gently down a stream and a single cloth trailing behind them, catching the sunlight like a sail. Part 6. The bowl with a name. When a bowl breaks, it does not forget where it was whole. The next morning, Toma returned to the old monk's room before the first bell. He held his own bowl in both hands, wrapped in the cloth as if it were a fragile treasure. His eyes still carried sleep, but his heart beat with anticipation. The keeper motioned for him to sit without a word. He was already awake, as always, sitting cross-legged before the low table, a tray of bowls in front of him. Today, however, there was one bowl Toma hadn't seen before. It sat at the center, alone. Unlike the others, earthen, muted, or simple, this bowl shimmered faintly, even in the dim morning light. Its surface was smooth, pale blue, almost translucent. A thin golden line curved through it, starting at the rim and winding downward, like a river frozen in place. Toma stared. The keeper noticed. "This bowl," he said softly, "is older than you, older than many trees in this monastery." Toma leaned closer but didn't reach for it. Was it always cracked? The old monk chuckled. "No bowl is born cracked, but it lived long enough to remember falling." He reached out and gently turned the bowl so Toma could see a mark etched on the inside, like the shadow of a forgotten name. "That's a character," Toma said, squinting. "But I can't read it." "Most can't," the keeper replied. "It's from a dialect no longer spoken. The monk who used this bowl lived here before even I arrived." Toma was quiet. He had never thought of monks as people who could die. It was easier to believe they simply faded into trees or became part of the wind. What happened to him? The keeper paused. His hand rested lightly on the golden crack. He made a mistake, one that cost someone else dearly. Afterward, he stopped speaking for 3 years. Not out of punishment, but to listen again. Toma furrowed his brow, and this bowl. It slipped from his hands the night before he left. He did not cry, or curse, or even try to repair it. He simply set it down beside my room and walked into the forest. I never saw him again. The silence stretched. Toma reached forward, but stopped halfway. "May I?" "You may." He lifted the bowl carefully. It was lighter than he expected, but not empty. Something inside unseen gave it weight. Not the golden resin, not memory, something else. Something like presence. "You said every bowl holds something." "Yes. What does this one hold?" The keeper closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to the wind for the answer. "Forgiveness," he said finally. "Not for others, for oneself." Toma stared at the golden line. It was not hidden. In fact, it seemed to glow with pride, like a scar no longer seen as shame. "Why did you repair it with gold?" "Because that is where the light enters." Toma placed the bowl back down, slower than before. He bowed not just to the keeper, but to the bowl itself. "Does it have a name?" "All bowls do, even if no one remembers." The old man took a thin brush from his robe and dipped it in clear water. He traced the ancient character inside the bowl once more, letting it darken with moisture. Its name means returning, but no one says it aloud anymore. Toma sat in silence. For the first time in his short life, he felt the weight of a name he didn't know how to pronounce, and the honor of knowing it existed. The wind stirred the edge of the curtain. The candle danced. Somewhere down the corridor, a bird called out once, then fell quiet. "Will I have a bowl like this one day?" the boy asked. The keeper smiled, not with certainty, but with patience. "Perhaps, but first, you must be willing to break." That afternoon, Toma wiped his bowl more gently than ever before. Not to keep it unbroken, but to remember it, just in case it ever was. Part 7. Sweeping the wind. It is not the path that needs clearing, it is the one walking it. The next morning came with light drizzle. Mist clung to the edges of roof tiles like threads of breath. The courtyard stones, slick with dew, reflected the grey sky like glass. Toma stood at the edge of the steps, holding a long-handled broom. He had been assigned to sweeping duty, not as punishment, not even as responsibility. It was simply his turn. Every novice had their day, and today, the stones were his. He looked out across the wide courtyard. Pine needles scattered like small green arrows, pointing in every direction. The old Bodhi tree in the center dropped leaves in slow spirals, as if time moved differently there. Where do I even start? He wondered. He set the broom bristles down near the cornerstone and began. The first few strokes were hurried, awkward. The bristles snagged on wet leaves, and the handle knocked against his shin. He huffed, adjusting his grip. After several attempts, he found a rhythm, but not peace. "Why is this harder than it looks?" he muttered, from the eastern corridor. The bowl keeper watched. He stepped outside without a word and made his way to the far side of the courtyard, taking up a second. Broom one shorter, older, its handle worn smooth by time. He began sweeping near the lantern post, moving slowly, steadily, each stroke deliberate. Toma glanced up. The keeper did not acknowledge him. He simply swept, one leaf at a time, one breath at a time. The boy watched him out of the corner of his eye, noticing how the man's shoulders didn't tense, how his feet moved softly over the stone. It wasn't work, it was listening. Toma stopped, stood still, then began again. This time, slower. He let the broom lead. He stopped trying to finish. Instead, he started to feel the sound of bristles against stone, the slight give of wet leaves, the way his breath moved with the motion of his arms. Without realizing it, he entered something quiet. No longer annoyed by the size of the courtyard, he simply kept sweeping what was in front of him. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Some leaves returned, falling where he had just swept. At first, he frowned, then paused, then smiled. So this is why they never finish sweeping here, he thought. The keeper glanced up. His eyes crinkled with something like approval. He stepped closer and asked, "What are you sweeping?" Toma blinked. "The courtyard," he answered automatically. The old monk tilted his head. "Look again." Toma looked down. The stones were clearer now, the path more visible. But then he looked deeper into himself. He wasn't just sweeping leaves. He had swept through impatience, through restlessness, through the voice in his head that asked, "When will this be done?" "I'm sweeping my thoughts," he said, slowly. "Good," said the keeper. Now you are practicing." They continued together in silence. Two shapes moving like wind and water across the morning stones. As they worked, a pair of crows landed on the far roof beam, cawing once, then flying off into mist. A cat stretched in the shadow of the lantern. The bell had not yet rung, and the leaves still continued to fall. When they finished, the courtyard looked much the same as when they began. But Toma no longer did. He leaned his broom against the wall with care, then bowed not to the keeper, but to the path. The old monk returned the gesture. "The wind always returns," he said, "but so can you." That night, Toma slept with the cloth under his pillow and dreamed of sweeping stars from the night sky one by one until only the moon remained. Part 8. A crack of light. It is not the bowl that shines, but the space where it once broke. Afternoon light drifted through the slats of the shuttered windows, casting lines across the wooden floor like quiet footprints. In the keeper's room, everything was still. The candle had not been lit. No incense smoldered. Only the hush of the wind and the breath of two beings, one old, one young. Toma sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands folded gently over his knees. He had stopped asking questions, not because he no longer had them, but because he'd begun listening for answers in other places. Today, the keeper placed a different bowl on the mat between them. It was grayish-white, simple in shape, almost unremarkably, till light caught it from the side. Then something shimmered. A faint golden line traced a curve down one side, like a river painted by moonlight. It wasn't as bold as the previous bowl repaired with gold, but it pulsed with quiet strength. Toma leaned forward. "This one is cracked too," he whispered. The keeper nodded. "Many of them are, but not all choose to show it." He picked up the bowl and placed it on the low shelf beside the window. As the sun dipped lower, a beam of light struck the golden crack just right, sending a soft spectrum of color fanning across the wooden wall. Pale pink, gentle green, the faintest blue. A rainbow born from imperfection. Tama's mouth parted slightly. "It shines," he said. "Yes," the keeper replied, "because it was once broken." Toma stood and stepped closer to the wall, reaching his hand toward the rainbow, trying to catch it. His fingers passed through nothing, and yet he felt warmth. Why does the light do that? Because the crack is no longer trying to hide, said the keeper. It welcomes the light, and the light enters. They stood together, boy and elder, both bathed in color born from fracture. "Do all cracks shine?" Toma asked. The keeper's gaze softened. "Only the ones we stop resenting." A silence followed, dense and delicate, like snow falling. In a dream, Toma sat again, facing the bowl. Who repaired this one? A monk who never spoke a word, but his hands knew how to apologize. Toma traced the line of color on the wall with his eyes, letting it settle into his memory like ink into rice paper. "Does my bowl have a crack?" he asked. The keeper smiled. "Not yet. But your heart does. I can see it in your questions." Toma didn't feel ashamed. Instead, he felt ... seen. He thought of the times he'd felt out of place, too loud, too soft, too unsure. He thought of the moments he wanted to cry but didn't know why. Maybe those were small cracks waiting for gold. "Can I fix them?" he asked. The keeper placed a hand gently over the boy's heart, not to heal, but to acknowledge. "You are not broken," he said. "You are becoming whole." Outside, the wind moved through the pines, no longer whispering, but Humming that night, as the monks gathered for evening chant, Toma sat a little straighter. Not because he wanted to be perfect, because he now understood that every chant, every breath, every pause was part of his repair. And just before he drifted into sleep, he saw again the colors on the wall, not from memory, but from inside. They had stayed with him. Part 9. The final wiping. When it is time to pass the bowl, you will know, not in your mind, but in your bones. The season had turned again. The mist in the mornings lingered longer. The air clung colder to the walls. The pine needles fell, heavier, carpeting the courtyard in copper and gold. Even the birds seemed to sing slower. Toma noticed it first, not with his eyes, but with his body. The keeper moved differently now. His steps were shorter, his pauses longer. His hands, once steady as water, now trembled ever so slightly when lifting a bowl. The cloth still glided across porcelain with care, but no longer with ease. And yet, he never said a word. There was no announcement, no confession, only the same quiet rituals, now shaded with fatigue. One morning, before dawn, Toma arrived at the keeper's room to find the candle already lit, but the old man seated differently, not cross-legged, but resting on a small stool, hands folded. Over his knees, a bowl before him, untouched. "Today," he said, "you will wipe the last one." Toma blinked. "The last one, for today?" he asked. The keeper smiled faintly. "No, the last one for me." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was sacred. Toma bowed deeply, then approached the bowl, a small wooden one with faded lacquer. It was unremarkable, and yet the weight of it in his hands felt ceremonial. He unfolded his cloth, now soft with memory, and began the practice. He did not hurry, he did not think, he only moved. Each stroke was slower than the last, not from doubt, but from reverence, as if he was cleaning not just a bowl, but the space between teacher and student, between breath and time. When he finished, he did not speak. The keeper extended his hand and touched the edge of the bowl once, then nodded. "You remembered," he whispered. Toma looked up. "What?" "To be here." That day, the keeper no longer touched any bowls. He sat with them, looked at them, whispered to them, "Maybe." But his hands remained folded. Toma began to rise earlier. Before the bell, he would clean the bowls, arrange them in rows, leave small offerings of folded cloth beside each one. The work was no longer instruction. It had become devotion. Other monks began to notice how the bowls gleamed in morning light, how the wind seemed to pause near the eastern corridor, how the boy moved not like a child, but like someone listening deeply. One evening, as the sun dipped into the ridge of pines, the keeper called Toma into the courtyard. The stones were warm from the day, the air fragrant with cedar. They sat together in silence, the way trees sit beside rivers. Finally, the old man spoke, not to give, but to release. "The bowl is yours now." Toma's throat tightened. "Which one?" The keeper smiled gently. "Whichever one you are holding." That night, Toma did not sleep. He watched the moon rise. He traced the grain of the wooden floor. And when the wind moved through the window, he whispered, "I will remember." Not just the old man, not just the bowls, but the way it all felt quiet, sacred, alive. Part 10. Before the morning bell. When you no longer wait for the bell, you have already heard it. The monastery was still wrapped in sleep. The sky hovered between deep indigo and pearl grey, and the clouds above the pines had yet to blush with the first light. No birds had begun their calls. No footsteps echoed in the halls. And most notably, no bell had rung. Toma awoke early, though he had not meant to. His eyes opened before thought. Some shift in the air had touched him awake. He sat up slowly, listening, silence, but not emptiness. A full, round, sacred silence. He rose, wrapped in his robe, and padded barefoot down the corridor toward the eastern wing. The wind met him there, soft and constant, brushing past his shoulders like a whisper that didn't need words. That as he reached the courtyard, he stopped there, in the very center of the stone square beneath the old Bodhi tree where light always touched. First was a single bowl. It had been placed with care. No note, no cloth, just the bowl, catching the first breath of dawn. It was the old keeper's favorite, worn wood. Faint rings circling its rim, one small golden seam glowing faintly. Along the edge, Toma did not need to ask. He knew. The keeper had risen before him, had walked here slowly, carefully, had placed the bowl in the heart of the monastery like a final bow. Then he had walked away, not from life, but from duty. He had let go. Toma approached and knelt beside the bowl. He did not lift it. He simply bowed. The wind passed through the courtyard once, swirling the Bodhi leaves in gentle arcs, and then settled behind him. Other monks began to stir. A door slid open. Feet stepped lightly across floorboards. Silence remained, but now it was shared. They gathered, one by one, around the bowl. No one spoke. No one needed to. It was understood. The bell would not ring this morning. And yet, every heart heard it. It echoed, not in sound, but in memory, in breath, in presence. Later that day, Toma returned to the keeper's room. It was clean, ordered. The shelf still held bowls. The candle had burned low, but not out. On the table, where the keeper once folded cloths and prepared for morning, there was only a single line drawn in ink. Let the bowl teach you what words never could. Toma folded the paper carefully and placed it beneath his own mat. From that day forward, he rose before dawn, not because it was his task, but because it was now his way. He tended the bowls. He swept the wind. He listened with his hands. And when young novices arrived wide-eyed, restless, full of questions, he greeted them not with answers, but with cloth. The bowl still sat in the courtyard for 7 days, not as an altar, not as a monument, but as a reminder of presence, of breath, of how even silence can bow. And though the keeper's footsteps no longer echoed in the corridors, the wind still passed through them gently, curiously, like a student visiting the place where it once learned how to listen.